The year was 1942. In the quiet, rolling hills of East Tennessee, the scent of fresh-turned earth usually meant planting season. But this time, it smelled of forced migration, of secrets, and of a power so vast it would tear the world in two. An army of surveyors, engineers, and armed guards descended on the peaceful, scattered communities of Elza, Robertsville, and Wheat, their arrival as sudden and final as a flash flood. They were the harbingers of a national imperative, a secret war against time and a distant enemy. They were the agents of the silent scythe. And in the span of a few shocking months, they began to carve out of the American heartland what would become a city of 75,000 people, a place that, by official decree, did not exist. Before the military came, this stretch of the Clinch River Valley was the quintessential American rural tapestry. It was a landscape defined by subsistence farming, deep-rooted family histories, and a slow, rhythmic pace of life dictated by the seasons. Generations of families, the Friels, the Scarboroughs, the Joneses, had worked the fertile soil, worshiping in the small, white-steepled churches like New Bethel and Wheat, and sending their children to one-room schoolhouses. They were the kind of Americans who felt the war keenly, with sons and brothers already fighting in Europe and the Pacific, but who believed the war effort was something thought over there, not in their own front yard. That illusion shattered in September 1942. The Manhattan Project, the top-secret effort to build an atomic bomb before Nazi Germany, had expanded beyond university laboratories and required a colossal industrial site. Major General Leslie Groves, the project's iron-willed director, needed three things: a remote, isolated location for absolute secrecy, a massive supply of electricity, and access to an abundant water source for cooling the immense, unprecedented production facilities. The valleys of the Clinch River, with the Tennessee Valley Authority power grid nearby, and the sheer geographic isolation of the ridges, met every criterion. It was perfect for their purpose. It was also someone else's home. The decision was swift, ruthless, and without appeal. On a designated day, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers personnel arrived with stern faces and stacks of acquisition notices. In the name of national security, the highest, most unquestionable authority during wartime, the government would seize 59,000 acres of land. The total compensation for the land, including homes, barns, and everything built on it, was set by government assessors, often at figures the locals considered a pittance. The eviction and the heartbreak. For the roughly 3,000 residents of the newly designated Clinton Engineer Works, the notification process was a traumatic blur. Farmers who had worked the land for a century were given a few weeks, sometimes barely two, to vacate. They were told little more than that the land was required for a critical war effort. What that effort was, they could not ask, and no one would say. Imagine the scene. A farmer, old man Friels perhaps, stands in his cornfield. The stalks are tall, ready for harvest, his life's work standing before him. A uniformed officer hands him a piece of paper. He reads the small print, his hands trembling. "You must be off this property by November 15th. You are not permitted to harvest your crops." The order was absolute. Crops were considered security risks. A saboteur could theoretically hide in a stack of corn, or contraband could be spirited away inside a bale of hay. The crops were left to rot. The ancestral cemeteries, where generations lay buried, were often recorded, but then fenced off and swallowed by the rising tide of construction. For many, this was the deepest cut, leaving their dead behind in a military reservation they could never again freely visit. The sense of betrayal and loss ran deep, the wound made worse with the official secrecy. The displaced families forced to scatter into neighboring counties, bore their sacrifice silently. They could not protest effectively, as to do so would seem unpatriotic in the height of the war. They became the first forgotten casualties of the atomic age, stripped of their heritage not by an enemy bomb, but by a chillingly efficient government mandate carried out by the silent scythe of necessity. Nuclear medicine. The first radioactive isotopes used for medical purposes were produced at ORNL, effectively launching the field of nuclear medicine. The very science that created the bomb was immediately used to save lives. Technological innovation. The immense challenges overcome at Oak Ridge led to breakthroughs in computing, materials science, and energy research that defined post-war America. The city of Oak Ridge, by the 1950s, had fully embraced its destiny as the atomic city, a place where high-level science was integrated into the fabric of daily life. The secret city was a perfect paradox. Born of secrecy, it became a symbol of American ingenuity. Built to end a war, it ushered in a new, terrifying peace. Founded on the displacement of the few, it created a lasting, prosperous home for the many. The fences are gone now, and the silence has been replaced by a bustling, open community. But for those who know its history, the valley still holds the echoes of the legacy of secrecy. It is a place where every scientific triumph is shadowed by the memory of the gadget, and every quiet neighborhood is built over the ghosts of the valley, reminding the world that the atomic age began not with a flash of light, but with an act of profound patriotic silence in the hills of Tennessee. The barrage of humanity. Construction rages. With the original inhabitants barely cleared out, the land was instantly overwhelmed by the greatest construction effort in the history of the South. The military reservation, officially designated the Clinton Engineer Works, CEW, became a chaotic, muddy hive of activity. General Groves contracted with some of the nation's largest construction firms, Stone and Webster, TVA itself, to turn rolling hills and pine forests into a sprawling metropolis in a matter of months. Trucks began to arrive in an endless stream bearing 50,000 construction workers, mostly young, eager Americans desperate for a high-paying war job from every state in the Union. Overnight, the population exploded from a few thousand to over 75,000 by the war's end. The original communities were obliterated, replaced by a sprawling encampment of temporary dormitories, prefabricated housing, and an endless expanse of bare, muddy earth that earned the city the nickname Mud Ridge. Housing was thrown up with frantic speed. Temporary worker accommodations, known as hutments, were barely more than shacks, uninsulated and unsuited for the Tennessee winter. Permanent housing, designed in the streamlined, utilitarian style of the military, was simple, identical, and organized in neat, confusing rows along newly cut, often unpaved roads. The city was a monument to industrial efficiency and temporary living, a place of sheer utility with no time for beauty. The air of absolute secrecy. What truly defined the city's genesis was the terrifying level of secrecy. The entire perimeter of the nearly 60,000 acres was eventually ringed with barbed wire fencing and guarded by thousands of military police. Roads leading into the reservation were controlled by formidable gates, Elza Gate, Solway Gate, manned by armed soldiers who checked every vehicle and every person. The city of Oak Ridge, as the residential area was eventually named, did not appear on a single map. Letters were postmarked with only P.O. Box 1000, Knoxville, Tennessee. Residents over the age of 12 were required to wear photo ID badges at all times. A pervasive, suffocating atmosphere of paranoia and compartmentalization settled over the place. The secrecy operated on the principle known as need to know.
For the tens of thousands of construction workers and plant operators, very few were ever allowed to know the full truth of their labor. The massive, mysterious plants they were building were given cryptic names like X10, a graphite reactor, Y12, an electromagnetic separation facility, and the colossal U-shaped K25, a gaseous diffusion plant. The workers were told they were enriching chemicals, separating components, or contributing to the development of a secret substance that would win the war. The security campaign was so successful it seeped into the very culture of the city. Posters hung everywhere with stark, intimidating slogans like, "What you see here, what you do here, what you hear here, when you leave here, let it stay here," and the famous, chillingly simple, "Loose talk costs lives." The residents, even the thousands of young single women recruited from across the country for technical jobs, learned to speak in code. When writing home, they never mentioned the location or the nature of their work. They simply spoke of the project or vaguely of their jobs in the plant. For a young American eager to contribute to the war effort, the secrecy was both a badge of honor, a sign of the importance of their work, and a source of maddening frustration. They were helping to win the war, but they couldn't even tell their own parents how. The silent scythe, having reaped the ancestral land, now guarded the harvest with an impenetrable wall of silence. A bustling, functioning American city had materialized in the remote Tennessee hills, complete with schools, bus lines, and drugstores. Yet it was a spectral place, a ghost town in reverse, built from scratch and defined entirely by its absence from the public consciousness. It was a secret city working on the greatest secret the world had ever known, and the foundations of that secret were built on the silent, profound sacrifice of the displaced farmers and the unwavering, yet entirely unknowing patriotism of its new temporary citizens. The stage was set for the atomic dawn. The fences were a physical fact, a high-tension perimeter of steel mesh and barbed wire fencing stretching for miles, but their real power lay in the mind. They enclosed not just the vast, hastily built infrastructure of the Clinton Engineer Works, but the very consciousness of the 75,000 people who lived and worked inside. After the initial wave of brutal construction, Oak Ridge, the residential heart of this invisible metropolis, settled into a bizarre, high-speed parody of normal American life, a community welded together by patriotism, youth, and a profound collective ignorance. This section, the factory floor of fear, life behind the chain-link fence, is the story of that existence, of the thousands of men and women who clocked in daily at sites like Y12 and K25, manipulating dials, reading meters, and stacking heavy objects, all while knowing nothing of the terrible power they were assembling. Their daily routines were the cogs in a machine of global consequence, running entirely on faith in a mission they could not name, under the constant, heavy shadow of military surveillance. The Great Migration and the youthful zeal. The promise of high-paying, essential wartime jobs drew people to the secret city like a magnet. They came from the cotton fields of Alabama, the coal mines of Kentucky, the urban centers of the North, and the rural stretches of the Midwest. They were overwhelmingly young. The average age of the Oak Ridge resident was in the mid-20s, a generation eager to contribute to the war effort, many of whom had never before lived away from their hometowns. They arrived by train and bus, carrying nothing but a suitcase and a government ID card that was already their most prized and most scrutinized possession. They came to a city that was a social experiment, a planned, entirely transient community dominated by barracks, trailer parks, and prefabricated cemesto houses, cement asbestos panels, laid out in stark utilitarian grids. Social life was vibrant. Dances, movies, bowling leagues, a necessary release valve for the high-pressure environment. Yet everything was tinged with the project strangeness. Dating involved showing an MP your ID badge. Casual conversation could, and sometimes did, lead to an inquiry from a security agent. The unspoken rule was simple: trust everyone, talk to no one. The riddle of the job: compartmentalization. The true core of the secret city was the need-to-know principle. The military's ingenious system of compartmentalization designed to keep the project's purpose secret even from the majority of its own workers. Imagine working a 12-hour shift, 6 days a week, in a cavernous, echoing building like K-25, at the time the world's largest building under one roof, covering 44 acres. Your job, for example, might be to watch a bank of switches and ensure that the pressure gauge stays between 40 and 60. You are trained to do this one specific task, day in and day out. If you ask your supervisor why that pressure must be maintained, or what material is flowing through the vast network of pipes, the answer is always the same, delivered with a stern look. That's on a need-to-know basis, and you don't need to know.
This systematic ignorance was both a defense against espionage and a psychological burden. At the Y-12 electromagnetic separation plant, thousands of young women, mostly high school graduates, were hired as calutron girls. Their mission was to monitor and adjust dials on complex magnetic units called calutrons. They were taught to read the instruments and adjust the knobs if the needle wavered, but they were never told what the needles measured. They were controlling the flow of highly enriched uranium-235, the scarce, fissionable material for the bomb, but many simply referred to the units they monitored as scopes, or the material as the product. A famous rumor circulated that they were separating metal for gold. Other workers thought they were sorting materials for the manufacturing of rubber tires or submarine paint. The work was often repetitive, exhausting, and strangely ambiguous. Men in the X-10 reactor area handled blocks of graphite in ways that seemed illogical, stacking them with painstaking precision. They knew they were making something heavy and dense, but the concept of plutonium production, a man-made element created from neutron bombardment, was a mind-boggling secret guarded by only a few hundred scientists. The ever-present shadow of the MP. The civilian workers were constantly reminded that they lived and worked inside a military reservation. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the military police were the ultimate authority. Security was a seamless, woven tapestry of physical barriers and psychological pressure. The badge. The ID badge was the true passport of the secret city. If a worker's badge was lost or misplaced, the entire plant could be shut down. Badges were color-coded, often dictating which parts of the enormous facilities a worker could access, further reinforcing compartmentalization. A clerk's badge wouldn't get her past the final gate to the highly secured areas. The search. Workers were routinely searched at plant entrances, checking for anything from cameras to unauthorized papers. Even an innocent sketch or a scrap of paper with notes could trigger an immediate interrogation. This was often humiliating, but the workforce, fueled by wartime determination, endured it as a necessary evil. The undercover network. The most insidious aspect of the security regime was the pervasive use of undercover investigators. These were FBI agents, counterintelligence officers, and ordinary workers, both men and women, trained to listen. They worked the assembly lines, served coffee in the cafeterias, and sat in the barbershop chairs. Their mandate: listen for loose talk. A slip of the tongue, a mention of uranium, or an unauthorized guess at the purpose of the K-25 building could lead to immediate dismissal, deportation from the site, or worse. The atmosphere cultivated a self-censorship that was profoundly effective, forcing workers to police their own thoughts and conversations. The censor. All outgoing mail from the city was subject to censorship.
Letters were opened, read, and any mention of Oak Ridge, the plants, the nature of the work, or even the weather conditions could be redacted or the entire letter seized. This ensured that no unintentional intelligence was transmitted, but it also cut off the workers from the comfort of sharing their lives with their distant families. The psychology of secrecy and the silent scream. The combination of strenuous work, constant noise, and absolute secrecy created a unique psychological pressure cooker. For many, the weight of the great secret manifested in various ways. Paranoia and isolation. Workers were urged to trust their supervisors but suspect their neighbors. This created deep bonds within work groups, the shared, unspoken burden, but a subtle underlying suspicion toward anyone outside that circle. A newcomer might be an agent. A friendly neighbor might be listening. The silent scream. The inability to share their life's work with their loved ones was intensely isolating. The workers knew they were part of something immense, perhaps world-changing, but they had to describe their days in hollow cliches. They were experiencing one of history's greatest dramas, yet their personal accounts of it were entirely censored. The resignation to the unknowable. Over time, a sort of collective resignation took hold. The secret became so large, so impenetrable, that it ceased to be an active mystery and became a fact of life, like the Appalachian Mountains or the Clinch River. They were simply doing their part for victory, and that was enough. The sheer scale of the operation, the thousands of people, the miles of fence, the billions of dollars spent, was a testament to the power of American manufacturing and the obedience of its citizens. Behind the relentless chain-linked fence, a city of unknowing patriots toiled, their hands on the switches of history, their lips sealed by the oath of secrecy. Every day they contributed to a final, apocalyptic purpose they could not name, a purpose that would soon shatter the war and the world's quietude forever. They were the anonymous, silent engine of the atomic age, and the factory floor of fear was their crucible. Oak Ridge, the secret city, was a fortress of scientific endeavor, but its true defenders weren't just the armed guards. They were the wives, the mothers, the clerks, and the Calutron girls who made up the civilian backbone of its society. They lived under a unique psychological burden, a forced state of unknowing. This was the city's hidden curriculum, the lesson that one must live a full, normal American life while simultaneously pretending that the central, all-consuming purpose of that life did not exist. If the engineers worked on a need-to-know basis, the women of Oak Ridge lived on a need-to-not-know basis. They knitted, they gossiped, they raised families, and they worked grueling shifts inside the colossal plants, all while navigating a dense fog of military secrecy. This section tells their story, the whispers in the laundry lines, the curious theories born of their ignorance, and the enormous invisible stress of being a patriotic American who could not, dare not, speak the truth.
The vast majority of the young non-technical workforce at the Y-12 electromagnetic separation plant were women. They were recruited largely from the rural South and Midwest, often straight out of high school or from small-town teaching jobs. They were called the Calutron girls, though the name was unknown to them at the time. Their patriotic duty was not in a munitions factory or a shipyard, but in a clean, quiet, and profoundly mysterious control room. Their work was monotonous yet critical. In the great horseshoe-shaped raceways of Y-12, hundreds of women sat before intricate panels of dials. They had been trained, often by scientists who barely understood the operational mechanics themselves, to keep a needle centered on a gauge by carefully adjusting a knob. They were told that if a needle drifted, the whole operation could fail, ruining a massive amount of valuable product. The irony was crushing. These women were separating the U-235 isotope from the far more common U-238, a process of chemical and atomic precision that was the key to unlocking the bomb. Yet they had no idea. They often found themselves correcting errors made by the renowned PhD scientists, who sometimes overthought the adjustments, while the young, untrained women succeeded simply by sticking to the rote instructions. As one worker famously put it, they were told to watch the dials and turn the knobs, like operating a cash register. This very success hinged on their ignorance. The scientists at Los Alamos discovered that when told what they were doing, the operators would often tinker and try to improve the process. When they knew nothing, they simply followed the rules perfectly. Their successful performance was a direct result of the hidden curriculum: do not think, just obey. The rumors and the world's most expensive soap. Human curiosity is impossible to fence in, and the vacuum created by official silence was immediately filled with rampant speculation. The residents, eager to rationalize the unparalleled speed and expense of their city, concocted their own unofficial history. One of the most enduring rumors centered on the material being produced. The metal being processed was highly corrosive, requiring specialized, frequent cleaning of the massive machinery. The workers were often splattered with the chemical solutions used to clean the machinery, and they noticed two peculiar things: the color. The final product, after being processed at Y12, left a residue that was often a rich, bright green. And the price tag. Workers knew the government was spending astronomical sums, and the slightest amount of product spilled or lost resulted in frantic, high-security cleanups. These two facts merged in the collective imagination to create the most popular, persistent, and entirely wrong rumor. Oak Ridge was producing the world's most expensive soap, or perhaps a rare type of military paint. Why? The soap theory suggested they were making a substance essential for waterproofing submarine hulls, a secret chemical that had to be handled with extreme care due to its cost and potential military value. The sheer green color simply reinforced the idea of a secret chemical compound. It was an innocuous, rational explanation for an irrational situation. Other rumors varied wildly. Synthetic rubber. Given the wartime shortage, many believed the CEW was a massive plant designed to mass-produce synthetic rubber. The Flying Fortress parts. Some speculated they were refining special alloys for B-29 bomber parts, requiring the extraordinary security and precise handling. These rumors were the only currency of shared information, and they were, in their own way, comforting. They placed the secret city's work firmly within the known bounds of World War II industry, protecting the residents from the terrifying notion that they were operating at the cutting edge of a physics that could end the world. The domestic front, isolation, and scrutiny. For the wives who did not work in the plants, life in Oak Ridge was a unique kind of wartime isolation. Their husbands often worked 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, and came home exhausted and legally mute about their work. The wives became the guardians of the domestic front, managing the household in a world of pervasive impermanence and constant surveillance. The censored mail, the letters they sent and received, were subject to the ever-watchful eye of the censors. A husband couldn't write, "I'm working in building K25, which is huge." A wife couldn't write, "My neighbor, Mrs. Smith, told me her husband is moving chemicals." This made communication with family outside the fences painfully superficial. One wife complained that her letters home consisted nothing but talk of the weather and how many ration stamps she had left. The scrutiny of service. Even common service jobs were part of the security apparatus. The telephone operators, the mail clerks, the laundresses, and the cafeteria staff were all implicitly part of the hidden curriculum. They heard snippets of gossip, saw the comings and goings, and were thus considered security risks themselves. They too were sworn to silence, and subtly encouraged to report anything suspicious. The Loose Talk campaign. The omnipresent posters, "Loose talk costs lives," were a constant, visceral reminder that their words were weapons. This campaign aimed directly at the social fabric, turning the natural act of human conversation into a dangerous, potentially treasonous activity. This was particularly aimed at the wives, who were generally perceived by the military establishment as having less need to know and more propensity for idle chatter. The implication was clear. The downfall of the project could be caused not by a spy, but by a carelessly dropped word at the grocery store. The mental toll, the cost of silence. The greatest cost of the secret city was the immense, unarticulated stress of living a lie. The people were forced to compartmentalize their entire reality. Emotional distance. How do you relate to your spouse when a huge, all-consuming part of their life must remain a sealed book? Marriages were strained by the silences. A husband knew his wife was doing something incredibly important, something that was aging him beyond his years, but she could offer no understanding, no shared comfort in the nature of his labor. Patriotic duty versus mental health. The residents of Oak Ridge were overwhelmingly patriotic, viewing the secrecy as a necessary sacrifice for victory. But that sacrifice was often emotional. The city had a high rate of absenteeism and stress-related illnesses, which were quietly managed by the project's medical staff. The psychological pressure of maintaining the illusion of normalcy while surrounded by one of the world's greatest secrets was a continuous drain. The lack of roots. The vast majority of housing was temporary, designed to be disassembled or sold after the war. This transiency, combined with the extreme security, prevented a genuine community spirit from fully forming. They were all in the same boat, but they were not allowed to discuss where the boat was going. The people of Oak Ridge learned to read between the lines. They learned to interpret the silence of their colleagues, the speed of the construction, and the severity of the guards as evidence of the project's scope. They came to understand that the thing they were working on was not just paint or rubber, but something of monumental, world-altering significance. They just didn't know what kind of world alteration it would be. The hidden curriculum ultimately succeeded. The citizens of Oak Ridge were the world's most effective defense against industrial espionage, not because they were spies, but because they were ordinary Americans who valued their silence and their contribution to the war effort above their own curiosity. They were the anonymous, silent patriots of the atomic dawn, waiting patiently in the shadows until the day their silence would finally be broken and the truth of the world's most expensive soap would be revealed. While the workers on the factory floor of fear toiled in blissful ignorance, a smaller, highly select group of men and women within the chain-link fences of Oak Ridge carried a weight far heavier than the lead bricks they sometimes handled. They were the scientists and engineers, the intellectual elite tasked with not just execution, but with inventing the massive industrial processes from scratch. They understood the true purpose of the secret city: to extract a teaspoon of purified, highly explosive matter from a mountain of ordinary ore, a process that would ultimately culminate in the destructive power of a single, terrifying weapon. This was the core of the Manhattan Project, a desperate race to time fueled by the existential threat of Nazi Germany developing the bomb first. This section dives into their intellectual struggles, the unparalleled industrial scale of their endeavor, the monumental K-25 plan, and the silent, unagonizing moral ambiguity that began to haunt them as the finish line came into view.
The problem: finding the needle in the haystack. The fundamental challenge of the Manhattan Project was not theoretical, nuclear fission was already understood, but practical: isotope separation. Natural uranium contains over 99% of the relatively useless U-238, but only about 0.7% of the highly fissionable U-235, the weapon-grade material. Chemically, U-235 and U-238 are identical. The only difference is in their atomic weight, a minuscule variance that defied all conventional industrial separation techniques. To build the bomb, they needed to enrich the U-235 concentration from 0.7% to over 80%. General Groves, in his characteristic approach of betting on every horse in the race, approved 3 simultaneous, competing methods for separation at the Clinton Engineer Works. X-10, the graphite reactor; designed to test the feasibility of creating plutonium, a totally new, man-made fissionable element via neutron bombardment. Y-12, electromagnetic separation, using powerful magnets in calutrons, operated by the calutron girls, to physically separate the isotopes based on their mass difference. K-25, gaseous diffusion, the most ambitious and scientifically challenging method, which was a gamble on its own scale. The K-25 gamble, a monument to impossible engineering. The K-25 plant was the most profound expression of the race against time. Built at the western end of the reservation, it was, at the time, the largest building under a single roof in the world, covering 44 acres, roughly the size of 24 football fields, in a colossal U-shaped structure stretching nearly a mile long. K-25 was designed to use the gaseous diffusion method. The concept was elegant in theory, near impossible in practice. Uranium hexafluoride gas would be pumped through thousands of porous barriers. Because U-235 is infinitesimally lighter than U-238, the U-235 gas would pass through the microscopic pores slightly faster. The enrichment would happen incrementally, step by step, in a long, continuous cascade of over 4,000 stages. The engineering challenges were staggering. The barrier problem. The porous barrier material, the heart of the plant, had to be perfect. Microscopic pores small enough to separate molecules, but durable enough to withstand the corrosive uranium gas. The initial attempts at manufacturing this barrier failed repeatedly, threatening to derail the entire process. Engineers worked relentlessly, often sleeping on cots near the plant, until they perfected a reliable industrial-scale barrier. The vacuum and seals. The entire mile-long system had to be maintained under a high vacuum to prevent atmospheric contaminants. This required thousands of specialized pumps and seals that had to be absolutely leak-proof. A tiny leak in one of the thousands of stages would contaminate the process and render millions of dollars of work useless. Every valve, every pipe joint was an individual engineering triumph. The scale. The complexity of scaling up a minute laboratory experiment to a building larger than the Pentagon was unprecedented. It required a massive, coordinated effort involving tens of thousands of workers, most of whom were unaware they were building the final ingredient for an atomic device. Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer, director of the Bomb Design Laboratory at Los Alamos, referred to the Oak Ridge production effort as the gigantic industrial enterprise that was the true genius of the project. The engineers and metallurgists, working under imaginable pressure, were inventing the future of nuclear industry on a minute-by-minute basis. They succeeded not through a single brilliant flash of insight, but through relentless, grinding hard work, problem-solving, and the patriotic drive to beat Hitler. The silence of the scientists. Internal conflict. As the plants finally began to hum, and the first traces of enriched uranium accumulated in late 1944, the atmosphere among the high-level scientists shifted. The joy of scientific triumph was increasingly mixed with a profound sense of foreboding. The race was being won, and the weapon they were creating was no longer a theoretical deterrent. It was a near-certain reality. Many of the scientists, particularly those who had fled persecution in Europe, were driven by the initial goal of ensuring Hitler didn't acquire the bomb first. Now that Germany was clearly losing the war, some began to question the ultimate target of their work. The dawn of responsibility. Unlike the workers operating the dials, the scientists knew exactly what U-235 meant. They understood the destructive yield, the thermal blast, and the radioactive consequences. This knowledge became a terrifying personal burden. The plea for warning. Some scientists at Oak Ridge and Los Alamos, like Leo Szilard and James Frank, argued passionately that the United States should not use the bomb against civilian populations without warning, or perhaps not at all. They drafted memorandum pleading with General Groves and President Roosevelt to consider a non-lethal demonstration of the weapon's power before its military use. The wall of authority. These moral anxieties were met with the rigid, unyielding structure of the military chain of command. General Groves's mandate was clear. Success meant building and delivering the bomb as an effective weapon to end the war quickly and definitively. The time for moral debate, they were told, was after victory. Dr. Clarence E. Larson, who worked at the X-10 graphite reactor, later spoke of the intense internal conflict. We were young, idealistic, and driven by a war effort. The morality of the weapon was a constant undercurrent, but the immediate pressure to achieve a scientific and engineering miracle overshadowed everything else. The question was always how they could make it work, not should they make it work.
The double life of the engineer. The engineers and scientists lived a double life that was far more taxing than the double life of the typical Oak Ridge resident. In the laboratories and control rooms, they spoke a hyper-specialized language of neutron cross-sections, thermodynamics, and criticality calculations. They argued passionately over designs, materials, and flow rates, a world of pure, objective problem-solving. But when they returned to their Semesto houses in the evening, they were forced into the same code of silence as everyone else. They couldn't explain their scientific breakthroughs to their wives. They couldn't share the agonizing uncertainty about a valve failure. And most importantly, they couldn't articulate the moral weight of what their scientific success meant for the future of humanity. This duality led to a necessary psychological defense. The focus became the process, not the product. They channeled all their immense intellect and emotional energy into solving the next engineering hurdle, the next leak, the next failed barrier, the next stalled calutron. The very act of problem-solving became an escape from the ultimate moral reality. The unstoppable momentum. By the spring of 1945, the momentum of the project became unstoppable. The K-25 plant, operating with an efficiency that defied its inventor's initial expectations, was producing highly enriched uranium. The Y-12 facility was refining it further. The X-10 reactor had successfully proven the production of plutonium. The necessary fuel was being manufactured in the secret city, and it was being shipped in high-security containers to the final assembly lab at Los Alamos. The scientific triumph was complete. The engineers had won the race. They had created the most complex industrial weapons system in history in less than 3 years. Yet this triumph came at a price: the erosion of scientific innocence. The scientists of Oak Ridge, by solving the seemingly impossible problem of isotope separation, had irrevocably linked pure knowledge with total destruction. They delivered the key to the ultimate weapon, stepping across a moral Rubicon that forever changed their relationship with their work and with the world. As the purified material left the gates of Oak Ridge, heading west toward the desert of New Mexico, the atmosphere changed from frantic urgency to a tense, almost breathless anticipation. The scientists knew their job was done. Now they waited for the ultimate, terrifying outcome of their successful race against time, the answer to the moral ambiguity that had been their silent partner throughout the entire secret journey. By the summer of 1945, the frantic pace that had defined Oak Ridge for nearly 3 years gave way to a stifling, nervous anticipation. The construction had largely finished. The mile-long K-25 plant, the sprawling Y-12 facility, and the X-10 reactor were all humming at peak capacity, performing the colossal, secret industrial ballet of isotope separation. The scientists had finished their calculations. The engineers had conquered their leaks and blockages. The race against time had reached its final agonizing pause. The purified material, the enriched uranium, and the man-made plutonium had been shipped out of the guarded gates and sent to Site Y, the secret laboratory nestled high in the mountains of Los Alamos, New Mexico. The scientists there were building the gadget, the term of art used to cloak the world's first nuclear weapon. This section chronicles the moment of profound, world-changing transition, the early morning of July 16, 1945, when a sudden, terrifying flash in the New Mexico desert delivered the irrefutable truth of their work. It is the story of how the news of the gadget's success penetrated the impenetrable secrecy of Oak Ridge, finally allowing its workers to confront the ultimate, earth-shattering meaning of their patriotic silence. July 16, 1945, the faint whisper from Alamogordo. At 5:30 a.m. Mountain War Time, in a remote stretch of the Alamogordo Desert, the world fundamentally changed. The test of the plutonium implosion device, codenamed Trinity, was successful beyond the most optimistic or pessimistic predictions. A ball of fire brighter than a dozen suns rose into the sky, followed by a shockwave that rattled windows over 100 miles away. The military term for the test was complete. The gadget worked. Back in Oak Ridge, over 1,000 miles away, the news was received through highly classified channels. General Groves and his inner circle knew instantly. They received the coded teletypes. The baby is born and its delivery was easy, or the operating room was a huge success. The tension among the military and scientific leadership instantly released, replaced with a grim, professional satisfaction.
However, the compartmentalization that had protected the secret city now served to delay the news, creating an uncanny silence. The thousands of technicians, Kelotron girls, and plant operators went to work that Monday morning just like any other. They monitored their dials, logged their data, and adjusted their knobs. Yet within the leadership, the secret had changed. It was no longer if they could do it, but what they had actually done. The first cracks in the silence. The news began to filter down in subtle ways, initially affecting those closest to the scientific leadership. These were not direct announcements, but changes in behavior. The scientists' relief. Key scientists who had been perpetually on edge, their faces etched with the strain of the K-25 and Y-12 challenges, suddenly seemed lighter. There were rushed, whispered conversations behind closed doors, often followed by an unexplained, if brief, moment of shared, dark laughter. The relief was palpable, yet its source was locked away. Increased security and vetting. Conversely, security immediately tightened. While the test was a success, the military was now protecting the most valuable secret in human history. The MPs seemed more numerous, the badge checks more severe, and the scrutiny of personnel far more intense. The unspoken atmosphere was not one of celebration, but of completion and final, absolute seriousness. The sudden shift in urgency. Maintenance delays, which had previously caused explosions of temper from supervisors, were now treated with patience. The material was ready. The time for panic was over, replaced by a cold, operational certainty. The average worker felt the tension in the air. The vibe of the city had changed, but they had no vocabulary to describe it. They were still separating the expensive soap, unaware that the final product was already en route to a potential target. The Great Reveal, August 6, 1945. The profound, agonizing secrecy finally shattered on August 6, 1945. At 11 a.m.,
The Oak Ridge Journal, the city's official and formerly censored newspaper, rolled off the presses with a banner headline that screamed the truth, finally liberating the city from its self-imposed silence. Oak Ridge attacks Japan. The accompanying news release, issued by the White House, explained that an American bomber, the Enola Gay, had dropped a single, unprecedented atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The bomb, it stated, derived its explosive power from the successful separation of uranium, a process which had been carried out at the gigantic, secret military reservation in Tennessee, known as the Clinton Engineer Works. The effect on the city was instantaneous and seismic. A collective, stunned silence. For many, the initial reaction was a kind of paralyzing shock. The sheer magnitude of the secret they had kept, a power that had instantly vaporized a city, was too vast to comprehend. The soap was a bomb. The endless, tedious turning of the dials was an act of apocalyptic creation. The rush of recognition. Then came the rush of recognition and the simultaneous unraveling of 3 years of rumors. Every worker suddenly understood the true meaning of their labor. The immense size of K-25, necessary to create the required quantities of gas. The absurd security, necessary to protect the most terrible secret. The constant emphasis on not spilling a single gram of the product, because that product was the material of death. The shared secret. The atmosphere of isolation immediately dissolved into a wave of collective emotional release. Workers ran into the streets, hugging and crying. They could finally speak openly about their work. The years of coded letters and whispered doubts evaporated in a single moment of shared, validated patriotism. They had built the bomb, and the bomb, they believed, would end the war.
The aftermath, triumph, terror, and the moral calculation. The days that followed were a confusing mix of celebration and existential dread. The triumph of patriotism. Most workers reacted with unadulterated patriotism. The war had been a grinding, bloody affair, and the idea that their work had ended it instantly brought an enormous sense of relief and pride. They were the heroes of the home front, the silent saviors who had spared the lives of countless American soldiers who would have otherwise died in a costly invasion of Japan. The secret city had finally received its public recognition. The terror of the unknowing. For others, particularly those who had worked with the material directly, the celebration was more muted. The vast, anonymous scale of the destruction, the complete obliteration of a city, was terrifying. They had not been told they were making a bomb of this magnitude. They had been working on a scientific problem, a technical challenge. Now that technical solution had a body count. The moral reflection. The scientists, whose moral anxieties had been stifled by Grove's command, now saw their fears realized. The debate over whether the bomb should have been demonstrated first, or whether it should have been used on a city at all, raged among the intellectual elite of the secret city, even as the ordinary worker celebrated. The scientific triumph came with an immediate, heavy moral cost. The workers' justification. Many workers struggled to reconcile their monotonous, peaceful jobs with the bomb's violence. Their moral justification was rooted firmly in the wartime context. It was necessary. It was for our boys. The enemy deserved it. This immediate rationalization was the final and most profound act of the hidden curriculum, the psychological need to justify the years of silence and the ultimate purpose of their work. The secret city, once a place defined by its internal mystery, was now a place defined by its external consequence. The flash in the New Mexico desert, initially a faint whisper, had become a defining scream, proving that the silent sacrifice of the farmers, the repetitive labor of the Calyatron girls, and the genius of the engineers had all converged on a single, terrible point in history. The secret city had delivered the atomic age,
and its residents were now forced to live with the knowledge of what they had created. The news of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings and the subsequent surrender of Japan in August 1945 did not end the story of Oak Ridge. It merely transformed it. The secret city was instantly unmasked, thrust from absolute anonymity onto the front pages of the world's newspapers as the birthplace of the atomic age. Yet the revelation of the bomb's existence only magnified the questions that lay beneath the surface. What becomes of a city built entirely on a temporary, terrible secret? How do its thousands of residents reconcile their patriotic labor with the catastrophic end product? And what lasting mark does a monumental act of secrecy leave on the American landscape and conscience? This final chapter, The Legacy of Secrecy, Ghosts in the Valley, explores the strange, uncertain fate of Oak Ridge in the immediate post-war years. It examines the painful process of the city opening its gates, the efforts to break the cultural spell of silence, and the profound, enduring moral questions that cling like a persistent shadow to the valley where the world's most dangerous secret was born. The Great Unveiling, a city emerges from the fog. The war was over, but the Clinton Engineer Works, the official name, was finally and publicly abandoned in favor of the community name Oak Ridge, remained a city under federal control. The fences did not immediately come down. The need for absolute secrecy had been replaced by the need for tight security and control over nuclear materials, and the Cold War was already dawning. However, the psychological fences began to crumble instantly. The exodus of the transients. The overwhelming majority of the original 75,000 residents were construction workers and temporary laborers. With the war over and their high-paying contracts terminated, a massive exodus began. Trucks loaded with families and their meager belongings streamed out of the valley, leaving behind the hastily built dormitories and hutments. Oak Ridge's population temporarily plummeted, becoming a true ghost city overnight. The decision to stay. The remaining core population, the scientists, engineers, and key operational personnel, faced a choice. General Groves's plan had been to sell the entire plant infrastructure for scrap. But the advent of the Cold War and the realization that nuclear power was the future meant the work had to continue. The key personnel, many of whom had only known life under the need-to-know rule, chose to stay, transforming the transient military camp into a permanent, unique American town.
The gates come down slowly. The most symbolic moment came years later, in March 1949, when the main gates, Elza, Solway, and others, were finally opened to the public. For the first time since 1942, a citizen could drive into the city without showing an ID badge. Yet the physical security was merely internalized. The central production facilities, Y-12 and K-25, remained heavily secured military installations, creating a peculiar urban geography, a free city built around a secret fortress. The broken silence, reconciling the past. For the thousands who remained, the biggest challenge was learning to talk about their past. The wartime silence had been an enforced habit, a patriotic reflex. Now, the government encouraged them to speak, not about the processes, which remained classified, but about the experience. The birth of an identity. Oak Ridge quickly embraced its unique heritage. The stigma of the secret city became a badge of honor. Residents, now permanent citizens with self-government, identified deeply with their role as the architects of the atomic age. They had a shared history, a collective moment of world-altering importance that no other American town could claim. The moral justification. The public narrative, promoted by the government and embraced by many residents, was the immediate, unwavering justification. The bomb ended the war. This conviction served as a moral shield, protecting the workers from the darker aspects of their creation. They had not built a weapon of mass destruction. They had built a device of peace, bought at the highest price. This narrative became the city's foundational myth. The price of knowledge. The scientists, however, could not escape the deeper questions. The Cold War immediately repurposed their work, forcing them to transition from a wartime effort to a perpetual arms race. Figures like J. Robert Oppenheimer, once celebrated, were later persecuted for their growing moral objections and advocacy for international control of nuclear energy. The legacy of Oak Ridge ensured that science would never again be politically innocent. It was forever bound to the military-industrial complex. Ghosts in the valley. Displacement and environmental scars. The ultimate ethical and physical legacy of Oak Ridge stretches far beyond its gates, affecting the land and the people who were displaced. The scars of the land. The rapid, unconstrained construction of the massive plants created immediate, devastating environmental consequences. The X-10 reactor, used to prove plutonium production, produced low-level radioactive waste that was handled with the crude standards of the 1940s. The K-25 and Y-12 plants generated vast amounts of chemical and nuclear waste. This pollution, radioactive effluents released into the Clinch River, massive landfills containing contaminated materials, became the lasting physical ghost of the Manhattan Project. Decades later, Oak Ridge would become one of the most expensive and complex environmental cleanup sites in the nation. The ghosts of Wheat and Elza. The original communities, forced off the land for national security, became the ethical undercurrent of the secret city. The land they left behind was ruined by chemical and nuclear activity. The homes, churches, and cemeteries were simply absorbed. Their loss, once silenced by wartime patriotism, became a permanent feature of the region's historical memory. The silent, profound cost paid by rural America for the dawn of the nuclear age. The descendants of these families now visit the few remaining structures, like the Wheat Church, as pilgrimage sites to a world that was erased by the silent scythe. The permanent legacy, the city of science. Ultimately, the most profound legacy of Oak Ridge was its transformation into a permanent, world-leading center for science and technology. The massive, unique infrastructure, the K-25 plant, though eventually decommissioned, and the Y-12 facility, was repurposed for the Cold War, producing materials for the burgeoning nuclear arsenal. More importantly, the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, or ORNL, which grew out of the X-10 reactor, became a national powerhouse. It pivoted from bomb-making to peaceful applications,